Please welcome to the stage UPCEA board member Kim Obink.
We're glad you're here. The summit's always an exciting event, and I'm proud to serve as the chair of the Network Senate for UPCEA this year. And just a quick plug for the networks, if you're not familiar with those, there is a network for online leadership and administration. So I assume most of you are here because of your interest in online. If you haven't joined that network, you should check it out. They do some really good work. It's a great way for you and your staff, your colleagues, to connect with people at all of the UPCEA member institutions. So please take a look at that and sign up if you haven't done that before. So I've been involved with UPCEA for a long time. It's kind of been my family, my professional association, and one of the things I love about UPCEA is that it changes as our professions change. There isn't a single person here that I've talked to this week that isn't undergoing some kind of reorganization, some kind of change, thinking about new models, new ways of doing things, and UPCEA is always thinking about that as well. So it's a really great place for all of us to share our concerns about the things that are happening and the changes that are happening, but also to get great information from UPCEA about how to deal with all those changes. So speaking of changes, credentials in all forms are a sub-theme for this year's summit. And alternative credentials, much like online learning, are the legacy of continuing education where so many of us started our careers and a space that we continue to reshape as we extend the reach of our institutions. That is why it's so important for all of us to understand the important trends and research that was shared by Jim Fong of UPCEA and Peter Janzow of Pearson yesterday. I know many of you were in that room, but if you didn't have a chance to go to that session, that their updated research report will be on the UPCEA website, and you can download it from there, so be sure and take a look at that. So today we turn our sights to some other players in the credentialing ecosystem: Credly, edX, and Parchment. Our moderator, Holly Zanville of Lumina, will introduce Pat Leonard, Kate Cho-Yu, and Matt Pittinsky with greater detail. So I'm just going to take this chance to introduce Holly. Holly Zanville is the Senior Advisor for Credentialing and Workforce Development at the Lumina Foundation, where she focuses on high-profile, large-scale projects with direct impact on the strategic operations and processes of the foundation. She speaks and writes on the meaning and value of credentials and how they can play a role in charting a path forward to increase access to and success in obtaining high-quality credentials. She has led Lumina's development of the National Connecting Credentials Initiative, which supports credential completion for returning adults with some prior college and no credential, as well as statewide approaches to reverse transfer degrees through the Credit When It's Due initiative. Holly is a national leader in credentialing and workforce development, and that is why we're honored to have her serve as the moderator for this exciting panel. Please welcome to the stage Holly, Pat, Kate, and Matt.
Well, we have to sit back. Cheers. Good morning, everybody. I'm very thrilled to be here. I have a lot of family in San Diego, so when I come here, it's truly a treat. I want to start out by introducing our panelists and give you a little background to what they do and what their organizations do, especially. Pat Leonard is Senior Advisor for Global Business Development at Credly, where she focuses on business development strategy, partner development, and relationship management. Credly is a leading online digital platform for issuing, earning, displaying, and rewarding achievement in the form of digital credentials. Credly works with both organizations and individuals to recognize demonstrated competencies and skills and communicate and track these verified achievements by issuing and managing digital credentials and badges. Kate Cho Yu is Senior Director, Strategic Partnerships at edX, a very interesting nonprofit venture founded by MIT and Harvard University based on a belief in high-quality education for anyone, anytime, anywhere, on a truly massive scale. The edX goal is to educate 1 billion people worldwide while transforming learning both on campus and online. edX is working through a 100% open platform and offers a really important model for all of us to learn from. And Matt Pittinsky is the CEO of Parchment and co-founder and former CEO of Blackboard. Matt is also on the faculty at Arizona State University, and he serves on the board of trustees of the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation. Since 2003, Parchment has been focusing on helping institutions to go digital, to make the transition from paper academic credentials to electronic transcripts, diplomas, or certificates. This includes helping learners to collect, store, and work with the credentials they earn over the course of their life. The idea that we've been hearing more and more about, a portable learner passport. So this is a stellar panel, and I've really been looking forward to hearing the remarks from everybody. So we've asked everyone to start out by taking a little bit of time to set the stage and to provide some context for credentials. So Pat, we're going to start with you. And during our preparation session, you shared that we really need to be careful about the terms that we use, and further that this is an ecosystem we're all sharing. I think the slide that you shared will help us visualize these ideas, so walk us through some of that.
Great. Let's see if this works. There we go. So we all appreciate what our adult learners and our students are going through, that the fast-paced change in the world of work. There's a term used often called VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. That's what your students are going through. And as such, the pace of change is such that the ecosystem really needs to be able to work better together than it has in the past, because each of the stakeholders has a really important aspect that need that they have and value that they can be able to bring. So the ecosystem really has those stakeholders of the issuers, those organizations that are the voice of authority. Who is the subject matter expert? And we talk about language in a moment that's going to be that's needed to be a common currency for this entire labor market ecosystem. But issuers can be a variety of things: associations, professional organizations, schools, employers themselves who are well-known Microsoft certified engineers, Cisco certified engineers, what have you, for employers that set the standard that are out there. The digital credentials themselves that can recognize knowledge and experience, skills, competencies. So that's the container in terms of what are you recognizing of the quality of content that's issued that's recognized and pushed out there by the issuers. Earners themselves, they run the gamut from this notion of lifelong learning is now actually coming into more serious consideration simply because you have to, because the pace of change is going so quickly. The shelf life of an undergraduate degree is quickly shortening. And then the opportunities in terms of being able, again, to have that ecosystem talk one to the other, starting with the end in mind in terms of who the employer is, who's the hiring organization, who's the hiring party, who's the admissions group that you want to be able to communicate these skills to, really require for language to be an important aspect of this. And I think we're coming to the point that it's no longer alternative credentials, but rather let's just call them, they're all credentials. Just like an undergraduate and a master's degree and a PhD, these are all versions of credentials. Alternative would suggest that we're going to ease back credentials into that unfortunate language we have of comparing vocational education as opposed to higher education. I think that's not a helpful analogy that needs to be there. This is an opportunity for us to be able to set the bar of language across the board, that credentials equal competencies, and the discipline is being able to take a look at each individual credential for the value that it brings. So the question then becomes, how does one articulate? How do you describe? How do you package it? And then how do you distribute that credential in a way that's useful for every one of those stakeholders that's part of that ecosystem?
Thanks, Pat. So that's getting us into Matt's area now. Matt, you and those of your colleagues at Parchment are really experts at detailing and displaying those kinds of many kinds of credentials. So talk with us about those credentials and particularly the consumers who are employers.
Sure. So I think Pat's done a wonderful job sort of laying out that ecosystem. And while each of those stakeholders was probably around 20 years ago, what's changed is the diversity of credentials that are being exchanged throughout that ecosystem. A typical learner earning many different kinds of credentials over the course of their lives, but also the expectation of those credentials, especially academic credentials. If you're a registrar of a university, you're used to your academic credentials being an inside baseball kind of a document, the academic transcript used by other institutions for undergraduate or transfer or graduate admissions. But now that we're issuing credentials that are for 2-hour programs, 2-week, 2-month, 2 years, and beyond, what we're seeing is both the traditional degree and these new kinds of credentials, the expectation is that they communicate exactly what Pat described, which is competencies. They communicate what we know and how well we know it. Kevin Carey has this wonderful line that the diploma tells you less about a learner than a prisoner of war is allowed to share under the Geneva Convention, name, rank, and serial number. And so I think kind of the meta challenge that we have is with these programs and with the benefit of technology behind these programs, where we're tracking a lot more about the learning process as well as learning outcomes, how do we communicate more in these credentials, not just for other academic institutions to use for their purposes, but for employers and licensing boards and others to use for their purposes, which is ultimately to discover talent, recruit that talent, and develop that talent, as well as the formative kind of uses of the learner reflecting on their own pathways and the kinds of skills they need, the holes they need to fill. So I think there are 3 big opportunities that we have as a community to be able to communicate more inside of those credentials. The first is we can move towards digital because paper-based records just makes it hard to communicate information more completely, more interactively, more dynamically. And I'll give some examples of that in a moment. You're not going to accept a 40-page academic transcript, but you might accept a transcript that has an XML data file embedded in it that communicates a lot more information than just that presentation layer. 2, we have the opportunity to innovate the credentials, to think about what does digital do that allows us to communicate things in a more useful way to different stakeholders, and I'll provide a few examples as well. And then last but not least, really view this through the eyes of the learner. I think that's the other big change in that ecosystem that Pat presented, is that once upon a time, the central agent in that ecosystem was the issuer. It was us, it was the university. And while it may not be popular in some quarters to say this, it really is the learner who is at the center of that ecosystem. They're the ones who have earned the credential, who need to verify it, share it, make it available to different stakeholders to take advantage of it. And so this idea that we're the record holder, things have to be locked down, is giving way to the idea that the learner is the glue that connects all these different stakeholders together, and we need to provide credentials in a way that allows them to make it much more portable. So what many institutions are beginning to do is really think about it comprehensively across all the different record types. And this gets back to that point that it's not an alternative credential and a traditional credential, it's just credentials. We have this breadth of education providers, right? Some credentials we're partnering with edX to deliver. Others we're doing out of our continuing and exec ed programs. Others we're doing out of our traditional degree granting and accredited programs, and everything in between. We have experiential learning data for campus-based programs, internships, and study abroad and leadership activities. Some of our programs have direct assessment that allow us to speak to competency information. We have learning management systems that have infrastructure that can speak to those learning outcomes, as well as the student information system that has the courses and the grades. So how do we have an infrastructure where you can take all of these data, to put them together, present different kinds of records, badges, certificates, transcripts, diplomas, automate that process in a way that brings the operational efficiency to the table that we need, and then lighting up all of those different capabilities that credentials need differently. Some credentials don't need to be printed and mailed. Academic transcripts do. Some credentials need to be put on LinkedIn and Facebook and used to advance the professional identity of a learner. Academic transcripts shouldn't be done for that because there's all sorts of private, secure information? Which of them do you want to allow to be downloaded and really controlled by the learner, and which of them don't? Which of them have receivers, like employers or admissions offices, who want structured data, and which are really about the learner and the look and feel around it? So this is an exciting time, and I'll hand it over in a moment. But we talked about the opportunity not just to create that infrastructure for operational efficiency and for the learner, but we're also seeing these great examples of innovation on credentials as well. So many institutions doing the clickable transcript, where you can click on the course ID, see the course description, click at UC San Diego, right here in town, they're doing the clickable transcript. You can click on the grade, and you can see the grade distribution for that course, which is kind of an interesting idea. And you can imagine the clickable diploma, the clickable certificate that allows you to drill in more. In the middle, you see Elon University and the visual transcript, which is taking experiential activities like internships and study abroad and presenting it in a much more concise and compelling way for a particular audience, in this case, the employer. And they've been surveying employers to see what they think about that visual transcript. And all the way to the far right, I think, left, sorry, depending on where you're sitting. No, it's the right. I was in drama club, I should know, stage left and stage right. Because you have this screen coming and then that screen going. It's all very confusing. But you have LinkedIn and Facebook and social sharing and the ability to advance people's professional identities. And that works particularly well with badges and certificates and diplomas. So hopefully that's responsive and kind of gives you the lay of the land a little bit.
I'm not worried about the left and right, Matt. I'm worried about just seeing the, the text so much. So Pat, piggyback on what we just heard from Matt, I was growing interested in the evidence and what some of the digital evidence looks like. And I know Credly's been working on that. We have a couple of slides on that.
Sure, just to show by way, there it goes. By way of example, and I was asked this question yesterday about keeping in mind, keeping the end in mind. Excellent point made by Matt in terms of making this learner/earner centric, in terms of this is something that they can control and they can share and they can communicate to whomever they want, and wherever they need to, depending upon their career pathway, continuing education requirements, looking for a next or new job, any of those particular things, but putting that control in their hands. That also suggests that there's some diligence in the creating of the actual credential itself as to the quality. And I know Kate's going to talk about quality as being a core kind of component of this. But understanding who's going to look at this, I kind of view this in the who cares and so what when you end up doing a credential. Is it, and this gets to the point in terms of this strategy, thinking of the end in mind first, end in mind in terms of how is this earner of a credential going to end up using this credential, and what is it going to mean to the person to whom they share it? And will they care, who cares, and so what? So there's a couple of opportunities to be able to connect that whole ecosystem. I'm just going to share two examples here quickly. This is an example of Bellevue University, four-year institution, went forward with various employers, Home Depot, SunTrust Bank, Verizon, what have you, and recognized that they had a whole host of employees who did not yet start or had completed their undergraduate degree. But they knew that they needed to be able to do some workplace education that was relevant for the job roles that they had. So they crafted a program in collaboration between Home Depot and Bellevue to be able to create this professional retail management credential. Now this credential is very meaningful in two straits. One is that it's internally recognized within Home Depot because this is an attainment of a badge you must have if you want to progress in your career trajectory. And it was important to be able to share also internally with Bellevue because it actually carries college credit that, dictated by how Bellevue created the program. So that means that this is a credential that's now in the control of this person who has earned this badge. And depending upon who they want to talk to, either the registrar or to their manager, they now have something that has value defined by that particular constituency. So, and the metadata, as what we were talking about before, is something that the lovely devil is in the detail. And this is a lot of the work about going on as to what's standard information that should be in all credentials that are describing what was the learning experience that you had to go through, what were the criteria for being able to earn this particular badge. Does it have an expiry date? Does it have a issue date? Is important, as well as expiry date. Is there evidence that you can now attach to a particular digital badge? If there is a video or audio, PDFs, any kind of media that you want to be able to attach where it's not only describing what it is that you had to do in order to be able to earn that badge, but you can actually show by virtue of appending that evidence directly to the badge. So there's no question of whether or not you're a good communicator. Here's a video of my presentation that I did here, here, and here. You can actually see me give a presentation as a good communicator for that badge that I earned. So again, it gets back to that point that Matt was bringing, that this is an opportunity to bring a degree of transparency of what the learning experience was and the accomplishments that were achieved in a way that a flat PDF or a piece of paper, as you heard from Jeff yesterday, he unpacked his box and huzzah, there it was rolled up in a scroll. He had to dust it off to be able to find his degree. So that's an example of what may resonate with all of you as you work with local employers and thinking about continuing education and special programs that you may end up doing. We also have now just launched something with ACE credit, which is the other way going back into academic institutions where there's corporate training and education programs, full stop. They were never created with partnership with an academic institution, but ACE will review them for college credit value, which then means that this individual from KFC, Disney, Jiffy Lube, Walmart, Walgreens, all of these that work with ACE credit, their courseware is reviewed for college credit. This is now in the hands of the earner that they can then take this, and it has all the same sort of information that's in the devil in the detail here. It's endorsed by who says so. ACE says so. They took a look at this and determined what the credit value was. And then that allows the individual to share in the variety of ways that Matt was just outlining before. Social media, here's a link, even to the point of requesting their transcript to make that process of taking that now credit valued work and be able to submit and be able to get college credit, add it to your, begin or complete your academic pursuit. So those are just some of the varieties of ways that's not just here's a credential for finishing this particular 2-hour program. There's a great variety that's open to you to be able to explore by virtue of using digital credentials.
Thanks. So we're kind of moving into the area of what are the pathways really looking like on the ground, particularly for things like micro-credentials. So I'm going to turn to you, Kate, and have us talk with us about the scaffolding opportunities that come up with the result of these new micro-credentials.
Sure. So how many of you are familiar with edX as an organization? Okay, fantastic, because a lot has happened. We're a relatively young organization, just 5 years old. We turned this past month. And we have learned a lot along the way. We're at a point now where we have about 11.5 million learners, 130 different partners. So we're at a scale now where we've got big data. And we've learned a lot about what the learners, the earners, are looking for. We have done formal market studies on an international scale. We also will always have experimentation and testing in our DNA, and we continue to do that even as we mature as an organization. What we've learned from them is that they really want what we call pathways to learning. So rather than, say, a single standalone MOOC, what they want is at the end of the day, really ultimately, is to be able to improve their life station. And they want to be able to signal in a meaningful, high-quality way to the market, look, I've got mastery over this competency, this subject area, this skill set area. So based on all the research and the data that we've done, we've really doubled down on what we call the MicroMasters. It is what some folks refer to as a stackable credential. It is really an unbundling of the credential as we know it today. And so it offers a learner really 2 big buckets of options. It can either lead to a traditional master's degree on campus, so it's complementary, but it can also serve as a standalone. Just given all the sort of micro and macroeconomic forces that I heard a lot of discussion about yesterday, both on the panels and out on the networking sessions. Because of that, we have seen that learners really don't have the time. They need flexibility. They want quality. So those are the things that we're seeing. We've surveyed them, and the number one thing that drives them to actually take and complete a course and have that willingness to pay for a course is actually institution brand. And then a close second after that is relevant content that's meaningful for their lives and their occupation, and that's taught in a very innovative and engaging way. So those were by far the two factors that motivated a learner to sign up, complete, and have that willingness to pay for a certificate at the end of the day. So how many of you are familiar with the MicroMasters programs that edX's partners are offering? Okay, so not a lot. So I won't read the slide to you, but the key thing to take away from this is that it is a pathway to learning. And it's not, I always hear, and in yesterday's panel on credentials, the challenge around what folks call cannibalization. This is not that. So just to be clear with folks, it's free access. The access to the information is free. Admission is usually open. And then it gives an opportunity for folks to apply then to the traditional on-campus program in that case. And so where are we today with this? We had just launched this last September. We've done 2 waves. We have a little over 3 dozen MicroMasters programs that are offered from a little over 2 dozen of our partners from all over the world. And that's the really exciting part. And if you look closely, what you'll start to see that's publicly available is that these institutions across geographic boundaries are actually starting to accept credit from each other's institutions. And I think in the next year or so, it's happening a lot more quickly than we had ever anticipated. You're going to start to see many more organizations doing that, not just within the United States, but all over the world. And that part is extremely exciting to us. So this is just a little bit more detail in terms of how the MicroMasters program works. I'm happy to talk with folks in more detail there, but just keeping in mind it's a pathway to learning, and it's 2 options where folks can either elect to go and get their full traditional master's on campus, but then also it's a way to sort of jump off of sort of this vaulting for your career, right? To either get a promotion, get a new job at a new area. I had just seen a report that came out a few weeks ago by the World Economic Forum that said something like 20% of jobs in 2020 don't even exist today. And by 2050, I think it's rising to almost 50, 60%. And you see some of those titles around data analytics, for example, that exist today. Those weren't there 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Some flavor of them was, but not with the eminence that it is today. So learners really need that flexibility. And so we're encouraging all of our partners to really offer these in a self-paced manner when possible. So quality. So in the halls of edX, we always say that we live and die by the quality of the MOOCs themselves on our platform, as well as the instruction that our partners provide. So on the left, Matt? What you see there is just a small sampling of our institutions who have offered MicroMasters programs just in the last 9 months. And we're just getting started. You're going to see a lot more waves coming. And so what you see here is it is signaling to the learners the quality. For better or worse, and just traditionally, the majority of these organizations have brand names. They're household names to some degree. Around the world or in their region. It signals quality, it signals rigor. And in other instances, there are some that are not as well known in that sort of rubric when you're looking at it that way. But what you come to see is when you actually look at the instruction and the innovation and the way they're using the technology to design their courses. I'll just pick on RIT, Rochester Institute of Technology in upstate New York. They're one of my favorite partners. They have just done a tremendous job innovating in their instructional design, and they are performing extremely well on our platform by all accounts, no matter which way you look at it. Enrollments, demand, willingness to pay, popularity, great reviews of the courses and the instructors and the use of technology. And so that's sort of where we started, but just confidentially between us in the room, I'm a little less excited about getting another Harvard University or another Princeton or Oxford. What we're really looking for are organizations that are just really willing to partner with us, roll up their sleeves and innovate in this area. And by innovate, I mean also technically, right? So our platform, Holly had mentioned, we are 100% open source. We're probably the only organization in the world that has their product roadmap searchable on Google and out there for the whole world to see. So we're very much committed to that whole open source movement. And so you're gonna see a lot of innovating in quality. You know, it's everything from randomized problem banks to integrating hand grading into peer assessments. We have over 50 plus different assessment types, so very rich assessment types offered on our platform. And because we're open source, we're able to grow and innovate extremely quickly from our open edX community as well as our partners. So they're helping us on that end. And then sort of on the right hand of the screen is the other part of our program. When our partners come on board with us to offer these MicroMasters programs, they essentially get an edX program manager. And that person acts as sort of your Sherpa, your beacon, and helps you from stem to stern in advising you in how to launch, design, market. What do we learn from the first run? How do we rerun? And then the second half of that is also around content, the content itself. So we have a small army of marketing folks now that is essentially quadrupled just in the last 2 to 3 years at edX. And we have also a content acquisition team, a data analytics team. We work very closely with our partners to help them understand what is in demand. And this is on an international basis, not just looking within the United States. And those teams, use the data from our learners as well as from the corporations that we've been talking to from the beginning. So I'll just move to that. Oh, sorry, did I go in the wrong direction?
No, that's
I think the corporations and the working with is coming later.
Yeah, no, I think this I would say stop here,
Okay.
because we're gonna expand into some more open questions. And
Okay,
so,
fantastic.
so actually we're done with the slides. You don't have to look at us again.
Okay.
You've got us in person here. So why don't I ask you all to respond to what do you think that's the context, and there's other things we could add to that we may want to, in a few minutes, add to that. But what credentialing trends do you think we should be following? So Pat, why don't you...
Sorry, what kind of?
What credentialing trends do you think we should be following most closely?
Trends to follow is, I think, that this focus in terms of just because you can create a credential doesn't mean you should create a credential. I think that there's some trend and some concern about making sure that we don't propagate credential pollution or God forbid, we talked about badge pollution. So I think one of the trends is a really serious consideration on strategy around credentials. Again, back to that point in terms of what's the end in mind that you should be thinking about when you're crafting something. And then that factors into how you end up building that particular strategy. How you end up building that credential constellation, we like to call it, of is this an independent credential? Do you stack these together to get a summative credential? Does each one carry its own weight and value unto itself? Or do you need to amass a couple of them in order to be able to take to the next run? This discussion at the very front end for credential trends, positive credential trends, more thoughtful consideration about that, I think is a beginning trend, happily so.
I have to add, 2 days ago I received the email, many of you probably received it too. I won't say the name of the group, but it's an academic group that's providing training to faculty about preparing their skills in the online world particularly. And they're going to grant, if you complete the program, a certificate of accomplishment, but they labeled it as a certification program. And certification has come, of course, to have a particularized meaning related to industry certification. So it just suggested it's just getting more and more chaotic for us to understand what these things mean. And so I hate to say that's a trend, but it is a trend until we all decide that we're going to have a Webster's dictionary of and try to hold ourselves to using words that really make sense to folks. Kate, what's your sense? You're in the middle of some big trends. Like, what's your sense about the credentialing trends we should be looking for?
Oh gosh, I think there are so many. I hate following trends per se, trendy and fads, but I think some real meaningful work is being done even at the high school level. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Mastery Consortium, the Mastery Transcript Consortium. There was a recent article about killing the high school transcript. I know there are folks who are looking to do that also in higher education on an international scale. There's a subset of our partners on edX who are doing that, and they also sort of transcend geographic boundaries. So I think that's happening with the work relevant to Parchment and Credly. I think also more unbundling of this credential, just because the learners themselves of all age ranges are really looking for more episodic learning. That 60-year relationship that we were talking about in the panel yesterday, I think is going to drive changes in how curricula is designed. I think the university will never, as we know it today, won't necessarily be replaced. There was a lot of hype about that, I think 4 or 5 years ago. But it's more that, and faculty will always own the intellectual property and have the final say on the design of the courses. But what you're going to see is a lot more industry being, initially I'll use the word accommodated, and they're going to be influencing to some degree, and I think with increasing degree, sort of the design of the curriculum, the outputs, flagging. We have a partner that is one of the top engineering schools in the world, and their corporate and private sector partners say, listen, we love hiring from your institution. You give us really top-notch, technically strong folks, but gosh, we could really use a lot of help in what the world calls soft skills, but what we at edX call power skills. So if you could start developing curriculum, or if you're not strong in that, and that would be quite expensive to hire faculty and get started in that, then could you start to partner with perhaps another edX institution, and they can offer that, and then you can start to offer credit across your institution. So I think that kind of collaboration with industry and other institutions you're going to see, just because the learners are demanding it. I mean, this is at a worldwide scale.
Matt, what trends do you see coming?
I would endorse both of those, and then I would add, I guess, the role of digital credentials in the marketing of educational programs and the discovery of those programs. So I thought your example was fantastic, which is in a world where you can really begin to see reviews of programs, understand actually what's learned and how well it's learned, hear from the students themselves. It's not necessarily the brand of the institution that wins out in attracting the student, but it's the quality of the experience and the reputation that's built, and digital credentials can make that more transparent, all the way to a lighter example, which is just the role of your graduates using their credentials on social profiles, which really activates them as promoters of the program. I discover, oh, I'm interested in being a doula. I didn't realize there was a local doula certificate. My friends all seem to be earning that certificate program, and they seem to speak well of it. So that offline word of mouth in a very local market context is now moving online, all the way to the credential transparency initiative and the engine. I sometimes mix these words together improperly. But the ability to start creating standardized tags, in a sense, that you could begin to associate your credentialing program to specific professional fields, specific standards of earning and completion, and that will open up all sorts of interesting search engine uses where you can say, I'm interested in being a pediatric oncology nurse, and I want to develop a particular skill on top of that in this area. Who in my market offers it? And credentials can kind of communicate out all sorts of metadata about themselves that allowed them to be discovered. And really, in that case, it's the educational service provider that's being discovered. So I think the whole marketing dimension to this is going to get really interesting.
I was really struck yesterday by two things, especially that Jeff Salingo said. And one was about we're facing the next decade around collaboration, and that partnerships, alliances, networks, maybe because I work at a foundation and we receive so many proposals, ideas that come in, a lot of them are around what we're going to partner with. It's going to be a network of, because they know, for one thing, we don't tend to fund individual institutions, but we are looking for larger scale, big footprint work, and that suggests you kind of have to work with others and make the case that you'll be able to be impactful and go bigger. So I really actually resonated to that concept of where we're headed. But I want us to talk, and then we're going to open it up to questions, so be thinking about them. There will be microphones that will be coming around. But I want to talk about the faculty role, because there was a really great question yesterday about faculty. Are faculty going to help move this forward? Is it going to be going slower because of the traditions of faculty? And I'll share one other thing. We work closely with a group called the National Association of Business and Industry Associations, and it's made up of 24 industry sector representatives, industry sector groups, that you would think aerospace maybe doesn't have that much to do with healthcare versus retail versus energy versus IT, but in fact they've been sitting in a room for the last few years, and they have many things in common and some things not so much in common, but together they represent about 75% of the future jobs by 2020 in the US. So that's a fairly significant group. And one of the things that they're going to is, they've said, under the belief that learning occurs everywhere, anytime, it's not just the sole ownership of higher ed institutions, with a recognition that a lot of learning is now occurring in employer land. A lot of people in workforce are being asked to take on essentially teaching roles, to do training, to do teaching, to either work with the intermediary groups and or to work with their associations to credential different kind of industry certifications, other kind of certificates, a whole range of micro-credentials. And so they asked us about providing help so they could develop some videos and some training modules for their employees who are going to become faculty, who already are faculty. Could they do a better job learning about pedagogy and different approaches? So the reality is that there are faculty, of course, in the college and universities, but increasingly there are faculty that are in the work world. Not that higher ed's not a work world also. That's a really interesting concept, to think that in the future we're going to have instruction coming from a lot of different folks and credentialing that is also occurring from a lot of different folks. So I just, sort of maybe that's my last question before we kind of open it up, is what do you think about this notion of who has responsibility for the quality and for the teaching and for the employer partnerships around credentialing? Just sort of an open question, and anyone could speak to it.
Who has the responsibility ultimately? I mean, I think it's all of us that are involved. I mean, so I'll just, share what I know at edX. We always say we're a nonprofit consortium. We don't mandate or dictate, but what we do is all the partners of the consortia have come together and have basically developed sort of this checklist, if you will, this checklist manifesto around quality and MOOC development. So that's backed by all of our partners. So in essence, no one can put up a MOOC on our platform without meeting the requirements, so to speak, around that. And so that is where I feel like our partners really held hands together, jumped in together and said, we believe in this sort of checklist manifesto, and this is what has got to fly in order for a MOOC. Now, every now and then a few sneak in. The data analytics always end up picking it up, and then we try to rework on that. I think it's really up to that, and it's also up to the institutions themselves in higher education. And I think some of what you had just said around how the faculty, I think a lot of faculty initially balk. These are, in some cases, Nobel Prize winning experts who have been teaching this subject matter for 30 years, and they say, I don't need assistance in teaching this. I'm the expert, and yet there's this whole area now that's coming around with the technology. It's instructional design or learning how to learn. What kind of learner are you? I wish I had known, when I was in college and high school, maybe I wouldn't have struggled as much if I knew how I learned, and just I think you're going to see a lot of that, and faculty becoming more open to that in order to get the quality there in this new medium. It's not just sort of the lecture capture anymore online.
Mm-hmm. I think Matt's point was well made, that digital credentials have a marketing tail that persists wherever and whenever that particular credential is shared. So that means quite a bit. If your brand is going to be affiliated, whether your brand is an employer that has created a credential, or a professional association, or a higher education institution, if you know that your brand is going to be wandering out there and that credential is going to be associated with your institution, I think that causes the issuer to take some more thoughtful care about rigor and quality. And faculty, and even though you may have someone who is a subject matter expert and the absolute source for the content, doesn't necessarily mean that they're a great instructional designer. So clarity in terms of we're all in this together. It takes more than, it does take a village to be able to put together a good quality credential, recognizing roles, responsibilities in terms of being able to pull that together. I think it's incumbent upon all of us to be able to make sure that the rigor and the quality is there, and making sure that You appreciate the fact of, do you really want to be able to have your brand attached to this particular credential that's going to be wandering around out there? Because it's going to go in places that you hadn't even planned. And that's a good thing, because that's with one click, that brings that brand new set of eyeballs back to you as an institution that you otherwise would not have been able to get. Do you want those, what kind of impression do you want those eyeballs to have based on the quality and the descriptors of that particular credential that they found?
Yeah, what do you?
I think it also, I would put it on the ecosystem as well. I mean, it's sort of the Forrest Gump principle that a credential is as a credential does. It is a type of currency. If we accept the green paper, then it's money, and if we don't, it's just green paper. And so that puts responsibility on the receiver, the admissions office, the licensing board, the employer, who has an experience and a pattern recognition of people who have completed particular programs and have those credentials to begin to speak up and be more transparent about how quality that signal is. So they have a responsibility, even though they had nothing to do with me choosing to go and earn this credential from a particular provider. Obviously, it's on the provider because they're the one for whom that credential is the brand promise of, it is the signal, right? And their reputation is being defined by it. So a traditional view of how we think about quality control and quality review. And then it's also on the learner. Learners are not agency lists. I mean, we have a responsibility to think about where do we want to invest our dollars. You know, these programs can be offered by the local university, they can be offered out of hospitals, they can be offered out of nonprofits that are active in our communities, they can be offered off of online programs that are global in reach and scale. And so we have to be a lot more thoughtful as a consumer of these programs to think about our credentials. And again, that's what is magical about data, is I can think it can light up all sorts of, it gives us more capabilities, those three actors, to bring more transparency and to be better quality controllers, I guess.
Yeah, thanks. Well, we're going to open it up for questions, and you're all experts in as well, so it's not just questions. We would welcome to hear your comments, your reactions to anything you've heard, or particularly on the trends you see or the biggest challenges that you're having in kind of moving within this space. So I know there are folks, it's hard to see with the lights coming on us, but there are folks that have microphones, and we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you for your presentation, all of you. I'm Mike Carey. I'm from Gonzaga University, which is a liberal arts-based university, and even our graduate programs, which are the only ones online right now, are liberal arts kind of based. And so looking at Jeff's presentation yesterday about soft skills being important, and I think one or two of you mentioned that as well, certain qualities like empathy and the openness to common good and collaboration and all those kind of things that we might define as a kind of soft skill. As I think about credentialing, in the early part of your presentation, I thought, I'm not sure some of the things that we're teaching are going to be easily quantifiable, measured. And then I think, Kate, you had mentioned the idea of the soft skills as well. Could all of you talk a little bit about your experience with trying to measure and credential things that we might define as soft skills that don't fall into the normal category of empirical measurement?
Sure. I'll just say really quickly, you'll probably have noticed, 4 or 5 years ago when edX got started, really online education lent itself to sort of the STEM courses much more so. If you look today at our platform, you look at the types of courses, the subject areas, and our actual partners, you'll see a lot more small liberal arts schools, and almost starting to begin to outnumber the polytechnics and the technical schools. And the reason is, one of those things is the technology, right? The artificial intelligence is one example. We have open response assessments that are backed by AI that was built by experts from Stanford and MIT. So these are sort of the authorities in artificial intelligence that has been just A/B tested, till tomorrow in terms of the rigor and the accuracy. And so what you're seeing now is the ability to assess your learners, right, in almost an essay-like format is one example. We also have other types of functionality now. You're seeing a lot more teamwork occurring believe it or not, even though these are massive courses with hundreds of thousands of people. The technology allows for there to be different cohorts in the same single MOOC that you might be offering. You can have a different learner experience by breaking them up into cohorts. And so you're able to sort of have that more personalized, highly social, highly interactive learning experience. And so folks are starting to see that just through the technology. It's enabling that kind of ability to assess a student in, say, the humanities, right, or in communications. And then they're starting to use that medium to teach and to measure learning outcomes in that way. So it's been very exciting for us, the open response assessment in particular.
There's some really interesting soft skills credentials that actually we've recently brought to the marketplace. And there are a couple different ways in which that's occurred. The University of Maryland system, for example, 14 different public institutions underneath the entire system, agreed on 8 soft skill competencies of how they were going to define them. They all came to one agreement in terms of what the language was, what the descriptors were. How was one going to assess? How was someone going to witness someone, catch them being good, but catch them in the moment of when they're being a good collaborator, or what was the compendium of experiences that you could be able to report out that this individual student was evidencing critical thinking or problem solving or communication or fill in the blank of any one of those along the way. So it wasn't necessarily the aspect of they took a critical thinking course, but rather it was a collective in terms of all the experiences that they evidenced in doing a regular kind of core discipline course. But it was language and a practice of review that's now been agreed across all of the University of Maryland system in such a fashion that then each institution can be able to say, all right, I take this as is. We are going to do a Towson University version of that because we're taking the core, and for the Towson program, they may customize it, add just a little bit. They're not taking away, but they can add to augment it and make it specially branded for Towson. But they're all agreeing as to what does good look like when one is assessing these competencies. We work with Wonderlic. They have an assessment specifically tied to soft skills boot camps, kind of thing, to be able to say, here's the example. It's a situational assessment to be able to say, how do you make these decisions, or what kind of evidence can you be able to share? So there's some really interesting models around this space because those are the kind of power competencies. I like that term rather than soft skills. Those power competencies are exactly the things that show up in the top 5 ranking that was described yesterday of can you problem solve, can you communicate, who are you as a team member, kind of thing. So each institution being able to define how are we looking at that now. Forget about whether or not you attach a credential to it. It's a core skill set that needs to be focused on as an educational institution. So how are we looking at that right now? And is there something that we can be able to capture to be able to provide as evidence and then be able to take the next step to be able to issue a credential in a way that's lots of data, lots of experience, attach my evidence pieces to this, that you can be able to clearly articulate sort of what did I have to do or prove in order to be able to get this credential in the first place.
I think it's absolutely the case that the principles of a liberal arts education are not limited to humanities courses. They can be applied to a whole range of topics. I'm going to answer this a little bit differently, though, because I do think there is an inherent tension between what a credential is meant to do and those principles. And this is a terrible analogy, but it just popped to mind. If you think about a digital photo, and you want that image to be, take up as little storage as possible. You don't want it to be 100 megs. But there's this trade-off between the fidelity of the image and how tight you can make that file size, how much you can kind of reduce it. The point of a credential is to be summative. The point of a credential is to try to be that compression algorithm that takes everything that you've learned in that program and gets it into this kind of concise format that it can be used efficiently in the different processes, like I'm looking at 50 resumes in 10 minutes, or I'm taking applications from 30,000 students, well, many more than 30,000 students, and have to make an admissions decision. So I don't want to gloss over the fact that there is an inherent tension between the richness and the depth of kind of a liberal arts principled education and how you can ultimately summarize that. I think we can get better and better. I think we can use algorithms to look at writing samples. We can record examples of a student's engagement with other students in an online course. There are things that we can do to make it more efficient and scalable, but we should not run away from, at the end of the day, the role of an expert faculty member and the brand of a liberal arts university, and say that we will accept those as intermediaries, as signals to what we care about underneath, and not necessarily expect that all of this is somehow going to magically, algorithmically be turned into taking this beautiful picture of the ocean and getting it down to, 10 bytes. So I don't know, that may be a terrible analogy, but or metaphor, but that's sort of what's in the back of my mind.
And I'll just add one other thing. From an employer voice, because of this group we're working with, the National Network of Industry and Business Associations, they are just starting an effort to look for, mostly through employer world, of what are the assessment approaches that are being used to undergird, to measure the common employability skills framework that they're using and promulgating, particularly among employers who are developing their own programs that would lead to credentials. So I think in the next year or so, we're going to see what do they come up with around what are some of the assessment approaches that are in place on the workforce side, which should be illustrative, particularly with the focus on the power skills. So there's going to be more and more things coming out around that because people are asking that. It's a wonderful question. So add that too. Is there a question here?
Dave Jarrett from Inside Track. We kicked off this discussion saying that it had to be all about the student and student-centric, and I'd like to bring us back to that. I'm wondering, we already have a situation where most students coming into higher education today don't know which credential to pursue. They're not sure if they want AA versus BA, BA versus BS, management versus business. If we're going to be proliferating the type and complexity of credentials that are available, what efforts are underway to make sure that students understand and can navigate an even more complex decision?
Who wants to?
I would say I think this ties into the trend that I tried to highlight, which is if you think about that student as being in a marketplace where there are lots of different providers and lots of different ways of packaging the education that they might be interested in, the opportunity we have through digital credentials is to tag these programs in a way that allow for tools to make that marketplace more efficient. I mean, I hate to reduce that choice to the choice of an airline and a flight or the choice of hotels or the choice of any other things that we do, but we take for granted that there's an entire marketplace of tools that we can go in and re-reviews and search by keywords and filter and do all sorts of stuff to understand what it is that we're looking for and how well it matches. And generally speaking, that doesn't exist in the education marketplace. And so the more that we are thoughtfully articulating what our programs, what our credentialing programs are about, what type of direct assessment do we bring, what do you learn in those programs, the more students are tied to those credentialing programs online, having claimed it and shared it, and their own experiences being aggregated to create more bottoms-up profiles, the more I think that student is going to be able to go online and not have the experience of an undergraduate student who basically is forced to look at rankings and US News World reports and things that are really not particularly helpful in really understanding what their four-year degree program will look like. And they'll be able to have something that's much more insightful and actionable and really sort of puts all those choices ahead.
And there's a lot more work going on in terms of growth far beyond ONET and career clusters and career pathways and the very aspect of us being able to have a more granular description of a particular job role, of what are the capabilities and competencies and skills and behaviors, KSAB across the board, of what you need to be able to master in order to be able to do this job. We're wonderfully, this is now the ecosystem is sort of helping to feed itself, of being more granular as to this is what it means to be able to do this particular job. Which skill sets do I have to be able to match? Is it a 70% match? What's my matching gap analysis I can now do, because that is now becoming more evident. And that's some of the work from the National Network is doing that. Many of the professional associations, National Restaurant Association, the AICPA, a whole host of them are getting more diligent about appreciating they need to be a more articulate champion about careers and on-ramps and off-ramps. If you have this set of competencies, this is not the only job for you. Did you know that this kind of also matches this job and this job and this job? So it really opens up the vista for students as they're kind of thinking, what do I want to do when I'm finished with my first drink of the Kool-Aid, of my education, and prepare them for the fact of, and know this is the continual sips that you're going to have to continue to have to progress in this particular industry or for this particular career. Going forward. I mean, this is, Bob Hansen and I were talking about this the other day, that the really need for being able to teach students that, welcome to the new world. You are now an HR department of one. You're going to have to kind of, be prepared for advocating for yourself, asking questions. If you don't have a mentor when you're a freshman, go get one. It's not about waiting till that senior semester when you're coming in and saying, now where is that person that's in the worst building on campus in the basement and what have you? That's not the time for having that conversation. It has to start even earlier, I would argue, in the K-12 space. But interestingly, this credentialing kind of movement allows us to be far more detailed and more thoughtful about pathing your careers.
Kate, you want to add to?
Yeah, just to piggyback on what Pat was saying, Dave, I think what you're getting at is we're at a time where it's kind of the wild, wild west right now, and it's just getting started, and there will be casualties, unfortunately. If you look at what happened with the for-profit and what may continue to happen with the recent policy that was just passed that was mentioned in the presidential administration today, I think that's just going to happen. And over time, what we're going to start to see with any new product offering in any new spaces, there becomes a tiering. And then you can imagine there will become both nonprofit and for-profit. I think within institutions of higher ed and then for-profit institutions, we'll start to do more advising, right? Student advising. It's going to have to be very tailored. I mean, can you imagine if we took the MicroMasters concept and did a micro bachelor's, which is sort of the holy grail, and then that diversification and that kind of hand-holding, really, for lack of a better word, that's going to need to happen at the student and learner level in order to make sure that they're making informed, good choices for themselves. But I think over time, like with any product, there's going to be a tiering. The winners will come out, the losers will fall out. You'll have a little bit of a gray middle, but I think the gray will sort of start to get pushed down by the quality winners at the top.
And I'll just mention that there, well, then we'll take maybe one last question. There is Matt mentioned Credential Engine, and there's a growing partnership of folks who literally are trying to build a GPS system for credentialing. I'll just say it like that. Looking if the travel industry can figure out a system of linked data among hotels, airplanes, trains, et cetera, rental cars, and then we can have the mom and pop apps that grow up around Expedia, Travelocity. Why can't we do that in credentialing? So we think we can do that because we should. The technology is here. It means capturing this whole array of credentials, and then apps will come, and one set of apps will be for students. We'll help them, we hope, navigate, learn about the credentials that are out there. What is the value of them? How do they link up, say, to what employers are saying they need in terms of skills? That could happen in the next 5 years, and this is as an ad for the session that's following this, one of the smaller sessions about Credential Engine, because we hope you all know about that because we're trying to capture all the credentials into this linked data system. So we think improvements are coming and that the problem was so severe that we've got to solve this together. So I think maybe you've got the last question.
John Karen at Hopkins. So we've talked a lot about today, or focused a lot this morning on providers that can create credentials and have currency. But I think this is also going to open up a situation in which our learners are going to come to us and say, I've done all these things. Yeah. So how best do you think universities and colleges can prepare to sort of evaluate all of that and tease out what has value or currency and can be applied?
So I think there's I fully expect there's kind of a 2.0 for PLA that's in play now. as you think about just working adults who bring forward their portfolio of work, to be able to have that submitted and considered for college credit that's there. I fully anticipate we're having a PLA wave that is credential oriented in a similar way. So it's, I think that's a great kind of next step, because learning happens in a variety of ways, not just in the classroom and not just in a structured online kind of program, but through this whole body of experiences, and how to be able to catalog that sufficient for review, and then being able to express what does that then mean in form of not only seat hour as we know it for college credit, but also identification of competencies, which is, again, back to that point in terms of what's the common labor market language that we might be able to embrace without necessarily kind of having to throw everything away, but rather it's not an either or, but rather an and. And that's a good part of the Lumina work that says, you know, its seat hours are here and they've been here forever. What's the challenge in terms of being able to add some competency language? On top of that, perhaps as we segue into this new world, maybe we'll get to fully just competencies in the future. We're at an interesting tipping point.
Matt, do you want to comment on the?
Yeah, I'm sort of deeply conflicted on it, to be honest, which is not a popular opinion to have. I mean, it sort of brings me back. I used to get very frustrated at Blackboard at this description of a group of Word documents hosted on a website as a course. That's not a course. And I'd like to believe that at least traditional academic credentials are more than just the sum of some discrete capability that you've documented through prior learning assessment, that we're bringing another layer to it. And so you should advance, right? There should be some credit for that, but it should be, the degree should be more than that. And if it isn't, then what's the value that we're adding?
Yep.
And part of the solution to that is that universities are more differentiated in the nature of the programs they're offering. So certainly there's a set of programs that are just, we're certifying that you can do A, B, and C, and you've learned that somewhere else, we certify it, life is good. But as PLA gets applied to other kinds of programs, you know, where more of those principles of a liberal arts education are part of it, and I'd like to think that the academic credential is, there's something in between prior learning assessment and that academic credential. That's the value that we offer as an institution. I don't know if that's responsive or not, but.
So, Kate, you can have the last word.
Oh boy, so much pressure. My brain is swirling. It's kind of on fire. I mean, just to piggyback on what they've both said, I will say I think universities need to think about the value that they bring to the learner, and that will help you get learners. What is going to be different about having, say, your first year be completely online, and then you bring the student in for their second and third year, and maybe the entire undergraduate experience, for example, is just 3 years? What is going to be different about Hopkins, right? You said you're from Johns Hopkins. What do you offer that no other school? So I think the value proposition of the university itself and that on-campus experience needs to be more thoughtfully strategized about and then defined and then, quite frankly, marketed, because the competition's getting pretty stiff. And then the other thing I have to say is I am just dying for more groups to really do the very good and hard work around the definitions, right? I'm seeing the taxonomy and the standards. There needs to be more institutions kind of having that institutional bravery and stepping up and saying, we're gonna be a part of this in a meaningful way, but in an efficient, effective way. You know, that's hard in higher ed, but to get it done, right? At least it doesn't have to be perfect, right? But get something out there that people can chew on and start to build upon. And so I'm seeing that in some of our edX partners on an international scale, which is incredibly exciting. But I would love to see more little groups doing that. The Maryland, the state system, the entire state system is a partner of edX. They've done that. I think it's been wonderful. This Mastery Transcript Consortium is starting to do that. And I think it's really important that very hard work, and you know, we talk to ACE all the time and they're saying, just do it. Like, we're just waiting, and I feel like everybody's waiting for someone else to do it, and we just need to really roll up the sleeves and get going, I think.
Yeah, I mean, not to be blunt, but my concern is that I'm often in meetings where it just feels like money laundering and sort of an abuse of higher education's, the confidence that we give higher ed, some prior learning assessment feels like money laundering. Like, I'm going to take this and I'm going to bless it, put some holy water on it. Or now it's coming off the illegal drug industry and it's in the respectable banking industry, and now the money is okay. And so, and look, if you, I don't know, would you show of hands how many people feel like they've been in meetings? So again, it's all about how well you do it.
Right.
But an online course is not a group of Word documents.
Right.
And prior learning assessment is not just sprinkling holy water
Right.
on the fact that you worked in a retail environment and
And it's
got
gonna
certain skills. And we've got to, getting back to the good actors and the bad actors, we have to think critically about these things and not just accept them as logical.
So we're going to call time.
Sorry.
No, that's great. I understand now that you have a theater background, which I'm happy to learn about. So join me in thanking our panel. Thanks.